Hello, Art 1 students. So, like I was saying, I'm just going to give you all a couple of demonstrations of some of the various facial features in our packet that you are required to do. I've shown you a closed lip, and then from previous demonstration videos, you have access to all of these ones. So the first thing I'm going to do is just remind you guys of your profile noses. Remember that all three of these are due. This is what they should look like by the end. So the first step for all of them is here, the second step, the third step, and the fourth step. So in this one, as you can see, I started with that first nose where the larger circle for the tip of the nose is sort of above the smaller circle, which becomes the nostril of the nose. So now what I'm going to do is just show you one of the other ones. So again, I would be starting with my larger circle for the tip of my nose. And remember that your circles do not have to be 100% perfect. Nobody's nose is actually a circle on the tip of the nose. So irregular shapes to begin with are never a bad thing. So then the next thing I'm going to do is go directly over to the side and put a smaller nostril that is even with that bigger nostril, or bigger circle, I should say. Smaller circle, even with the bigger circle, so that I am following along with that second example. I'm going to go ahead and get that third one started as well. So again, it's going to start with the bigger circle for the tip of the nose. And then on this scenario, my smaller circle for the nostril is just a little bit above that larger circle for the tip of the nose. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the circles do overlap. The more your circles overlap, the smaller the entire size of the nose is going to be, because there's less space between the outer tip of the nose and the back of the nostril. Whereas if someone has a much wider nose, you might separate these two circles a little bit more to add more distance between the tip of the nose and the back of the nostril. So now going on to step number 2, I'm just going to go ahead and draw in some of my lines that help to define the nose a little bit more. Remember that most of these lines you will eventually be erasing. Because when we are shading our human features, we do want to make sure, as usual, that we do not outline things. We want to make sure that our shading is what creates the range of values there and the separation between various parts. Don't want to make my nose too pointy there. So then remember that it's very important to get this step correct, because if you don't get the line work portion correct, then you cannot fix it with the shading. The original line has to be as accurate as you can get it, or else the shading will not really matter a whole lot. So now here I'm going to go ahead and go to my next step on this one. I'm going to go ahead and erase some of these lines just a little bit. Not completely, but just enough so that when I am working on the shading, they're not necessarily in my way. So again, tip of the nose, nostril are even on this one. And I'm going to go ahead and start in with my shading, holding my pencil sort of far back, so that once again, the graphite is primarily on the page instead of being too turned up to where you're just using the tip of the pencil there. And again, even though this is my nostril, I'm not necessarily going to jump right in with my darkest dark. And some of the shading that goes around that nostril here. And there is a bit of a shadow sort of in between the two circles. So we want to go ahead and get that in there. And it does go all the way around that nostril circle. So again, it's very important and helpful for when you are shading to kind of go in the direction of the skin almost. On the example in the packet, it's got a lot of sort of crosshatch shading to where the lines all go in one direction, kind of like this. And that is perfectly fine. Just keep in mind that you may have a little more smoothing out to do if you see a lot of pencil lines at the beginning. So again, I'm just looking more at my reference image from the packet than I am at my paper, so that I can make them match as much as possible. Being careful to avoid sort of that highlight area so that I leave it as the lightest part there. And then I'm going to go back in with a little more value now in my shading. Remember that you want to create all of your value transitions with your pencil, not with the tortillon. The tortillon is great just for kind of smoothing in the values that your pencil creates. You never want to rely on it for your shading. Gonna put just a little bit of shading on the actual nostril itself here. Again, leaving that reflected light around it, even though I may have to go back in with the kneaded eraser and erase some of that reflected light back in there. That's absolutely fine, because you'll remember the shading, especially on the face, is definitely a back and forth process. You erase, you add, you erase, you add, so on and so forth throughout the entire process there. So again, still just on that third step here, only using my HB/No. 2 pencil. Now I'm going to go up to a higher B pencil. And I'm going to start by sort of fixing the outer edge of my nostril here, because it's a little bit rounder than I would like it to be. It's a little bit more square if you look at that fourth example. So I'm just going to go around that edge, squaring it up a little bit with the value scale. It starts darkest right around the edge of the nostril and then gets lighter as I move away from the nostril. Still not at my darkest dark, because as you remember, and you've probably heard me say 1,000 times, shading is very relative. So you do not want to finish one area before finishing sort of the whole thing. You definitely want to make sure that you develop the shading everywhere, not just in one place. So that might be a bit more of an accurate representation of sort of that outer edge of this particular nostril. Remember that each person's nostril is going to be different, and it is a very definitive part of a person, actually. So you will want to make sure that when you are drawing a person, you look very closely at what their particular nostril shape is, and the size and the position of it in relation to the tip of the nose. So now I'm just going to go in and erase back some of my reflected light here. On this example, the reflected light is brighter at the top than it is at the bottom. So now I'm just going to put a little more value back on the bottom portion. So that the reflected light is there, but it's not quite as bright as it is up here. Accidentally erased away a little bit of my shadow there. So now I'm just going to deepen that nostril shadow in here. Pressing down pretty hard with my 6B. But it's not just a solid space. It is still going to be a value transition. It is still going to get lighter as I move down. Towards the little septum, I think that's what it's called, part of the nose. So now I'm going to go in and just look for anywhere where I need to darken some of my values elsewhere. Sometimes that means softening the reflected light as well. Other times it means covering it up and then erasing it back out. But still working to avoid my highlight. And this particular nose, in general, is also lighter than the first nose, which can be an important thing to notice because it might just mean that the person's skin tone is lighter. So you might not get your darkest darks as dark as they are on that first nose, and that's fine. Just going to darken this part. Remember to squint. I know it sounds odd, but when you squint, you can see where darker values are needed and where lighter values are needed. It just helps you see the contrast a little bit more plainly. Now I'm going to just brighten up the highlight area here. And here. And then I'm going to go back in and make sure that I don't have any outlines per se, which just means that this is going to become a value transition into that highlight. Keep in mind that if you had a background here, it would just stay white because it would stand out against the background. But since our background is just white paper, the best thing to do is put a very light gradient where that line would be.